Honourable member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, I rise with mixed emotion to debate this bill since it's not the first time that I've spoken on this issue. And yet, the dire need for secure, adequate, accessible and affordable housing is no less significant now than it was when this matter was before a previous Parliament. This bill received its support then, and there's every reason for it to receive the same support now. When each of us here wakes up in our ridings, we wake in accommodations that we can afford. In fact, I would wager that many of us have cottages, or in the case of some here, a second residence for when they are in Ottawa. We are more than fortunate enough to afford that luxury, but not every Canadian is. According to the most recent figures, which date back to before the recession in 2008, which brought about serious economic instability, 13% of Canadians exist in what is called, quote, core housing need. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation defines this situation as when, quoting again, housing falls below at least one of the adequacy, suitability, or affordability standards, and one would have to spend 30% or more of its total before-tax income to pay the median rent of alternative local housing that it is acceptable. Housing is adequate when it is reported by its residents as not requiring major repairs. Housing is suitable when there are enough bedrooms for the size and makeup of resident households, according to national occupancy standard requirements. Housing is affordable when dwelling costs less than 30% of total before-tax income. These are basic common-sense criteria that should be inalienable. Yet still, we can easily recall the images that came from Attawapiskat last Christmas, where none of these standards were met. Houses that were little more than garden sheds made of plywood, more mold than wall. In the face of the most recent economic crisis, this government has been more than willing to promote its position within the G8 as an innovator and model for the rest of the world. And yet we exist as the only member of that group, one of a few of all industrialized countries, without a national housing strategy. In fact, trends would show that we similarly lag in the development of a national food policy, another mechanism to combat poverty. It will be disconcerting to a majority of Canadians if this Conservative government does not feel it is the federal government's role to more meaningfully deal with the national crisis of poverty, housing, and homelessness. Indeed, on May 9, 2012, this very Parliament passed motion M331, brought forward by the Honourable Member for Shefford, confirming that the federal government, quote, should A, keep with Canada's obligation to respect, protect and fulfill the right to adequate housing as guaranteed under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, B, support efforts by Canadian municipalities to combat homelessness, and C, adopt measures to expand the stock of affordable rental housing with a view to providing economic benefits to local housing construction businesses. Today's bill, C400, is the natural progression from that motion. If, in fact, we are genuine about dealing with this issue, and our previous support of Motion 331 was more than a meaningless facade to leave people thinking that we actually care. Michael Shapcott, Director General of the Wellesley Institute, a funding provider for multiple expert studies on housing and health, is clear on this issue. Canadians with homes are healthy Canadians, and healthy Canadians mean reduced health care costs. Yet another reason that we need to pass this legislation. Just yesterday, Mr. Shapcott wrote that while this bill is before the House, Toronto added its 700th name to the roll of men and women who have died as a result of homelessness in Canada's largest city. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities is also clear on this issue. FCM Policy Advisor Joshua Bates said in committee during the last Parliament that, and I'm quoting, chronic homelessness and lack of affordable housing are not just social issues, they're core economic issues. They strain the limited resources of municipal governments and undermine the economic well-being of our cities, which are the engines of national economic growth, competitiveness, and productivity. According to the government's very own economic action plan from September 2010, every dollar invested in housing reaps a net benefit of $1.40 to the Canadian economy, spurring growth, jobs, and productivity. Meanwhile, homelessness costs our fragile economy $4.5 billion each year without any net benefit at all. Clearly, investing in this problem is the only marketable solution, the only one that will negate the detrimental impact this scourge has on our economy while fostering growth and productivity. More still, the Senate report in from the margins shows that this is a cross-partisan issue. The subcommittee comprised of Liberals and Conservatives concluded that regulatory constraints, time constraints, and declining operational support from the federal government were interfering with an integrated consideration of housing and homelessness. Specifically, they identified that, and I'm quoting, unaffordable and inadequate housing, even for those who are currently able to meet their needs and aspirations, can contribute to poverty and to a spiral that can include losing jobs, dropping out of school, and being unable to sustain families, end quote. To that end, the report very clearly recommended that an integrated approach to housing and homelessness requires that the federal government, in collaboration with provincial governments, representatives of municipal governments, First Nations organizations, and other housing providers, develop a national housing and homelessness strategy. We need a national housing strategy, and we need that strategy to work for lower-income and marginalized Canadians now. My own community of Guelph is no exception to this. In my life before politics, my time with the Wellington and Guelph Housing Authority, working with valuable community groups like Onward Willow, Women in Crisis, and now on the Guelph and Wellington Task Force for Poverty Elimination, affirm my strong conviction that taking action to create affordable housing is, without question, one of the most effective ways to lift entire families out of poverty and into prosperity. And still, as of this fall, Guelph's vacancy rate is 1.4%, well below the 3% which is considered a healthy balance between supply and demand for accommodation. Meanwhile, the population of Guelph and the surrounding Wellington County has grown 11.2% in the past decade. As of this month, unemployment in Guelph is at 6.2%. While Guelph's economy is above average for Ontario, affordability remains a challenge for families and seniors. The Guelph and Wellington Task Force on Poverty Elimination has observed a 120% increase in families using the shelters system. When you combine a worryingly low vacancy rate with job market instability and general concern about the economy, very little choice is left for those at the lower end of the housing market, leaving individuals and families to accept accommodations that are painfully below standards. Not a week goes by without a constituent calling, concerned that they are on a 4 to 5 year wait list for affordable housing in Guelph, and it leaves me feeling helpless that I can offer no solution. Across the country, an astounding number of citizens either remain homeless or live in inadequate housing. More than 300 to 400,000 Canadians move in and out of homelessness, and there are 1.5 million households that lack secure housing. Approximately 3.3 million live in substandard housing, and more than 750,000 families live in overcrowded housing. Instituting a national housing strategy is more than simply a compassionate consideration. It is also the most effective way for Canadians to be sure their tax dollars, which fund our social programs, are spent in the most efficient, effective, and accountable way. With a nationwide comprehensive strategy, we are all better positioned to make a difference. In closing, I call on all members, on compassionate grounds and in the interests of smart, sound economic policy, to pass this legislation, and let us begin the dialogue which will enable Canada to join its G8 partners and do the right thing for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.